here. So if you do have suggestions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, question, or an email, and we'll get back to you. But yeah, I think that's all from my side. Kenton, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, like Raj said, thanks everybody for joining. I'm Kenton, I'm a field engineer here at Astronomer. Super excited to talk to everybody today about the Airflow API. This is a topic that I think is really important, maybe slightly lesser known with Airflow, but it's a really great tool to have in your toolbox. So we'll kind of go through how and why you might want to use it. One other thing to note on the chat, I think Zoom defaults to sending messages only to hosts and panelists. So unless you're trying to only reach me and Barrage, you might want to change that to everybody so that everybody can see your comments. And yeah, as far as questions go, Raj will answer them in the chat as we go through where relevant. We'll also leave time at the end for a Q&A. So definitely speak up if there's anything you want to talk more about. But with that, I will go ahead and jump in here. Slideshow. So like I said, today, super excited to talk about the Airflow API and go through an intro. I'm going to start with some slides that kind of go through the background information you would need to know about the API and kind of where it came from and the state it's currently in. I'll also do a pretty extensive demo, so actually showing some things you can do with the API, and then we'll kind of talk about specific use cases where it might be relevant to implement it in kind of real world scenarios. So first off, just to kind of back up at the very high level, so far in case anybody is new to Airflow and is joining this without a lot of Airflow experience, Airflow is a tool for programmatically authoring, scheduling, and monitoring your data pipelines. It was originally developed inside of Airbnb. It's now an open source top-level Apache Software Foundation project. Everything that we talk about today is going to be focused on the open source. So anybody can go, use open source Airflow and use the API for free. So that will be our focus today. Obviously at Astronomer, we are heavily invested in open source Airflow. We really believe that sort of the de facto standard for pipeline orchestration. So, and to kind of set the stage for the Airflow API, I want to talk a little bit about Airflow 2. So Airflow 2 was released in December of 2020. So it's been out for a little over a year now, so quite a while, but there are still a lot of historical users in the community who are still using Airflow 1X. And, haven't gotten around to upgrading yet, but Airflow 2 was really a game changer in terms of kind of development in the project. It's faster, it's more reliable, it's much more performant at scale. It's really a lot easier to use in sort of a production context, especially in a medium to large organization. And a lot of the new features are going to allow for increased adoption across an even wider range of use cases than original, than Airflow 1 could be used for. Some of these great new features I listed here. Obviously, the one I'm going to highlight today is the stable REST API. So that's really the first thing to note about the Airflow API is that when I refer to the API throughout this webinar, I'm referring to the REST API in Airflow 2. If you are using Airflow 1X, so you haven't made it to Airflow 2 yet, there is an API. I'll talk more about this, but it's not the one that I'm talking about today. Just in case you're not familiar again with Airflow 2, there's a lot of other great features as well. So a lot of these things listed here, again, are going to help with Airflow adoption, just make the experience of using it a lot better and more performant. I'm not going to go into those things since they aren't the topic of this webinar, but if you are interested in any of these other topics listed here, just note that a lot of these we have actually done webinars on, or we have done webinars on or have written guides or other materials as well to help with their adoption. So feel free to ask questions if you want links to any of those resources. So again, for sort of some background and context on why we're talking about the Airflow 2 REST API specifically, Prior to Airflow 2, the Airflow API was experimental. That means it was not actually officially supported. It wasn't well documented. If you've looked at the documentation for the Airflow 1x API, it was just not very helpful. There wasn't a lot of information about, the endpoints or what you needed to put in a request or what you could get out of it. And there weren't actually very many endpoints at all. So it could be used to trigger DAG runs programmatically, but it wasn't really used for much else than that. So it wasn't, again, really considered like an actual supported tool in your Airflow toolbox. That has all changed with the full REST API that was released in Airflow 2. The API is now stable, so it's fully supported by Airflow. It's very well documented. We'll go through the documentation throughout this presentation, but it's actually really easy to use. It is based on Swagger and the Open API spec, which is really great for standardization. It makes it easily accessible by third parties. It's really secure, so I'll touch on this throughout as well, but it has authorization capabilities that are parallel to the Airflow UI, which was not true of the 1.x API. So that was potentially a security issue for some folks who oftentimes had to just turn the API off entirely. With Airflow 2, has full authentication capabilities. And it's super functional. So we'll talk a lot about the functionality throughout this webinar, but at a super high level, the API now includes CRUD operations on all Airflow resources. So you can do not just trigger DAG runs, but you can actually even manage your Airflow instance itself, including the infrastructure. So much more broadly useful in terms of what you can do with it. Which brings me to our next slide of what can you do with it. In general, the REST API is going to support almost anything you can do in the Airflow UI. This is not a complete list here. I'm going to keep referring back to the documentation kind of throughout this, which is going to show you all of the endpoints that you can access. I highly recommend going through it for sort of discoverability, and we'll do a little bit of that here. But some of the things that you can do that are super common with the API, which I think other than the first one, none of these were possible with the old API. You can trigger DAG runs or rerun DAGs and tasks. You can delete DAGs. You can set connections and variables. You can create pools. You can, again, kind of more related to the Airflow infrastructure side, you can retrieve any Airflow DAG import errors or things like that, which are super useful for, implementing tests and or I should say automated tests and things like that. You can also monitor the status of your scheduler and Metastore, get information about those. You can manage your users. So again, there's a lot you can do with it. So this is all really going to help with your ability to interact with Airflow in a programmatic way. So if you're using Airflow already, you're probably already used to using the UI. The UI is really great. It's super functional, but sometimes it's not great for, especially if you need to automate any of these interactions, the API is going to be a much better way of going about that. So check out the docs. Again, I'm going to go through some of these and actually show them in just a minute and like how I would go about using them. But I do want to link them in here since we will be sending all these materials out afterwards. The slides will be included in that. They're going to have links to the documentation. Again, these are all Swagger docs now. They're super, super helpful when figuring out how you can, if you can use the API for your use case and then how to go about doing that. I also want to talk about actually using the API. So I mentioned earlier that one of the great things about the REST API with Airflow 2 is that it's much more secure, and part of the reason for that is, or why it's more secure, is that authentication is actually required with the Airflow REST API. So before that was not the case, you cannot use it in your Airflow environment without using some form of authentication. A bunch of different forms are supported. So Airflow has great documentation on how to set it up for some of the more common forms like Kerberos, Basic Auth, things like that, but you can also roll your own. So you have a ton of functionality in terms of how you want to set up that authentication. And in general, anything that you might do to authenticate to the Airflow UI, you can also use that for the API. It is controlled with a setting called auth backend. So when you set it up, that's what you're going to look for in your Airflow config. Note that the default for that parameter is to deny all access. So if you were to go today and you've never used the Airflow API and you've just set up an Airflow environment, and you were to try to use the API, you're probably going to get an access denied, because it does require user intervention to actually go in and say, I want to enable the API and here's the authentication that I'm going to use. Again, that's really great from a security perspective, but it does, again, take that extra step on the part of the user to get started. You can easily check what is currently set in your environment using the Airflow CLI. So copy that command here. Again, the slide will be a great reference for you afterwards when we send it out. And I'll show you using that in my environment in just a minute. The Airflow documentation, again, has instructions to set all of this up. And then I'll also just note that if you are an Astronomer customer, or if you're using the Astronomer CLI, which I'm going to show, that part is open source, and I'm going to show that today, your auth backend is already set up for you. So you can, if you are using the Astronomer platform, you can create a service account, but you don't have to go in and set up that auth backend in addition. So just a note there. So now kind of that we've set the stage and about what the API is and sort of how you can go about using it, I want to talk a little bit about why you might want to do this. And we're going to focus kind of the demo in this webinar on some common use cases. Specifically, these three that are listed here. These are things that we've seen at Astronomer a lot within the community as well as our customers. So we think that they're, commonly occurring, and using the API will help serve a lot of different people with these common use cases. So those, again, are, the first one is programmatically rerunning DAGs and tasks. So I'm going to actually show this in a demo in a minute. That's a super common thing that people have to do. Failures happen. Obviously, you can go into the Airflow UI and rerun a DAG or a task at any time, but if you have a really large scale Airflow environment, maybe that's not tenable. That's not something you want to do, or maybe you don't want to have to interfere at all. You want to manage it all sort of externally to Airflow. The second is implementing cross-deployment DAG dependencies. So I'll show this as well. This is something that the diagram is sort of highlighting here. We, in general, recommend that any dependencies between your tasks or even between DAGs are implemented in the same Airflow environment, but sometimes that doesn't work for your use case. Usually that's because of organizational structures and access control, or sometimes because of conflicting, Python requirements or things like that. So you have DAGs in two separate Airflows and you need to implement a dependency between them. The API is the only way to do that. So we will show that. It actually works quite well. And then we'll also talk about creating event-based DAGs with remote triggering. So that's, the concept of triggering your DAG from some other system external to Airflow based on some event. So we'll kind of talk more about those use cases there. So from there, I'm going to switch gears briefly and kind of dive into demoing some of these things and showing how the API works. Before I actually dive into that, again, I want to talk about the documentation a little bit more. Again, don't worry too much about the links. Well, you can Google it and find this really easily, but we will be sending out, all these materials afterwards. But again, just want to highlight all of this information here that's available to you. So we're obviously going to talk about some of these specific use cases in this webinar today and show them. There are many more use cases that the API covers that we won't have time to cover. We would have to keep you here all day, and I'm sure everybody has, other things that they need to get on to. So we're going to keep this to 1 hour and just focus on a couple of them. But the documentation is a great place to come to, again, just sort of discoverability for figuring out what else the API can do. As an example, It's, super helpfully divided into categories here. So it's actually pretty easy to sort of find what you're looking for based on this menu. All of the endpoints are going to be well documented here with response samples, query parameters, and everything that you need to actually make these requests. So it's really pretty easy to get started once you have set up the API in your environment. The other thing I'll point out is for the authentication, there's a little blurb about it here. Again, this has the command that you can use to check what's currently being used in your Airflow environment. But it also is going to link to this page in the Airflow docs that shows how to set up authentication for various different types. So if you're not working with the Astronomer CLI or on the Astronomer platform, you'll have to go and set this up. You can always just set up basic auth, which is probably the most simple if you're just trying to play around with it. But again, you also have a lot of other options there. As an example to show that, I'm going to hop over to my terminal here. So I am running Airflow locally for this example. I'm using the Astronomer CLI to do that. We'll have links to that in the docs that we send out after this. It is open source, so if you want to use that to play around with the API or anything else, you're free to do so. You just have to have Docker installed. So now that I have this running locally, what I've done here is I've actually exec'd into my scheduler container so that I can use the Airflow CLI. And I'm going to go ahead and run that command that I just gave in the docs to get that auth backend parameter. You can see what it printed out as this Flask app builder current user. Basically, this is just using the same form of authentication that I would use to get into the UI. So in the case of our CLI, that's essentially a basic auth method where you have an admin login. Again, this probably isn't what you would be using if you're running this like in a production Airflow environment. You would probably use whatever auth that you're currently using, but this is a good way to check that. So that's what we'll use here for most of our examples. Cool. So from there, I'm going to come over and show an example of running some of these, making some API requests to sort of show what you can do with it, and then we'll dive into those specific use case examples. So I'm doing all of this from Postman just because it's sort of easy to show the results. Obviously, you don't have to. You can do this from wherever you want to send an API request. As a note, I do have in the slides and an appendix for when we send it out afterwards, all of the requests that I'm going to make today. So you'll have all of those sort of for reference if you need them. As a quick example, so again, I'm running this on my local Airflow instance. So my URL is going to be my localhost 8080. And then the rest of the URL will be API/v1 and then whatever endpoint you're hitting. So as a first example, I'm going to use the providers endpoint to show me what providers are in my Airflow environment. So if I go ahead and send that request, you can see because I'm running with Astronomer's Airflow image, we install a whole bunch of them automatically. So this is actually pretty useful. So I can see I have, Amazon, I have Kubernetes, I have Elasticsearch, I have Google HTTP, a whole bunch of providers installed in my environment. So to make this request, other than the, I sent the GET request to this URL with the authorization. So again, this one, I'm using basic auth in my environment. The credentials with the Astronomer CLI are admin. So that's what I've entered here. That's what I'm going to use for all of these requests. This might be different depending on, what sort of authorization you're using. Another example, I can get import errors. So again, send this request. I don't have any in this environment. If I pop over to my local host, here I am. You can see that matches. I don't have any import errors here. Again, this could be a really useful query if you're doing automated testing on your Airflow environment. That's one way of implementing checks like that. So that could be really helpful there. Next one is, so I can trigger a DAG run. So we're going to talk more about the use case around this as we go through in a little bit, but this is, maybe one of the most common ways of using the API is to trigger a DAG run from external to Airflow. So this is the equivalent of clicking like the Run DAG manual button in the Airflow UI. For mine, I'm going to trigger, this DAG is called dependent DAG. So I put my DAG name in here, and then the endpoint is DAG Runs. I do have a body in this request because I am passing in an execution date. So this is going to tell Airflow when you want to run the DAG. You can pass in, now or something like that. So I have the body of the request there. Note that if you do have a body for your request, you will probably have to add this header with this content type and then application JSON. If you don't do that, you'll likely get an error that it's a malformed request. But if I go ahead and send this, you can see that just updated down there. So I just triggered that DAG. Here's my dependent DAG in my environment, and you can see that's now running. So again, just another way of essentially doing the same thing as clicking the play button, manually triggering, but you don't have to be in Airflow to make that happen. So next, or I should say, the first of those use cases that I mentioned that I want to actually show is rerunning a DAG or tasks. So essentially clearing a task instance. That's one way of rerunning DAGs or tasks within Airflow, is you essentially go in and clear out the failure, and that will trigger Airflow to rerun that same DAG run or same task instance. One thing that I can do is, so you just saw me send a post request to the DAG runs endpoint. I can also get the DAG runs endpoint, and that's going to give me all of the DAG runs for a particular DAG. So if I come back to my Airflow environment here, the DAG that I'm going to use for this example is this random failures DAG. So I've set up a DAG with a single task that obviously randomly fails. So I've got a DAG here. I've got, some successes, a whole bunch of failures. This thing runs every 4 hours, I think. So if I come back and look at the results of this request, that's what I'm looking at here. Is each one of these blocks is corresponding to one of those DAG runs. And you can see I've got the state in all of them, success, success. Started off pretty good on this one. And now you start to see some of the failed ones show up. So I'm not doing this in this case, but if you were going to set up an actual program to do some sort of rerunning of failed DAGs, totally automatically, one thing you can do is, use this endpoint to get the failures in that case, and then programmatically take that information and put it into your next request. So that next request is going to be to clear the task instances. So in this case, again, I'm using the sort of DAG subset. My DAG is called random failures, and then this endpoint is called clear task instances. So with that, I'm going to send a post request to this endpoint. I'm going to provide the task IDs. So if you want to rerun everything in the DAG, you can provide, all of them. I only have one task, so I'm just going to rerun this one. I give a start date and end date. So I'm going to put in, a range here if I want one. Again, this is something that you might consider getting this information programmatically based on the results of the other query, if that's kind of the way you're going about implementing this use case. And then you have some other parameters that you can set, including only failed runs. So you can give it a range and say, I only care about rerunning the ones that failed. Maybe you care about everything for your use case, so you could turn this to false. I'm going to leave it true in this case. You also have other parameters kind of to further control which particular tasks you're going to rerun. So I'm going to do this for this range, which is some of the DAG runs we were looking at, but not all of them. I'm going to go ahead and send this. You can see it cleared maybe 8 or 10 of them or so that were failed within that time frame. If I come back to my DAG here and refresh, oh, sorry, this one's really fast. But if you notice that some of those turned from red to green because they reran. I might try this again just to, I'll pop back to it a little faster this time. I'm just going to widen that range, clear any other failures. There we go. So you can see all of those red ones were cleared. They're now rerunning. And this DAG randomly fails, so they might fail again. But again, one way of programmatically implementing rerunning your DAGs. Cool. So then the next use case that I wanted to wind up on again is implementing cross-deployment DAG dependencies. So again, one reason that you might want to have dependencies between DAGs in different environments is, you know, your DAGs might have dependencies between them, but you need to control who has access to those DAGs. And because of that, you've split them up into different environments. They might have conflicting Python or other package dependencies. That's another reason that we often see people split up DAGs into different, you know, Airflow instances. So sometimes you can't get around that and you still need to implement those dependencies. For cross-DAG dependencies within the same environment, you might have heard about using like the trigger DAG run operator or the external task sensor. Those options don't work if your DAGs aren't in the same Airflow. So the API is really the only option you have, and fortunately, it's pretty easy to implement. So for this example, I'm going to have a DAG in this Airflow environment, so the one running on my local computer here, trigger a DAG in another environment. So the way I set that up is I have my API DAG, which has this task that is going to trigger my dependent DAG, and I have some just kind of placeholder Python operators on either side of it. You can see for this, I'm using the simple HTTP operator. That's typically the most straightforward within Airflow, although it's an API request, so you could implement it some other way if you needed to. What the code for that looks like, again, is pretty straightforward. I'm going to import that simple HTTP operator. I'm going to define up front here any body for the post request that I need. So in this particular case, I am passing in an execution date, and I'm grabbing that programmatically using an Airflow variable, which is definitely what you want to do for item potency if you have a use case like this. You might have other stuff in your body, so you can pass in, you know, DAG params or things like that through a configuration. If you need to. I don't have that in this example, but anything else you need to define, you're free to do so. And then for the actual task itself, I have this API trigger dependent DAG, my simple HTTP operator. I do need to set up a connection, so I'll talk about how to set that up in just a second. Again, the endpoint is the same one I just showed. So I have my API DAGs. I give the name of the DAG. It's going to be the example DAG. And then it's going to be my DAG runs endpoint that I send a post to. Again, I have to define that header. That content type is application JSON because I am passing in a header for this request. And then my data is the actual body of the request. So that's my JSON body that I defined up above. So super simple in terms of DAG setup. Again, you do have to define a connection. So this is going to allow this Airflow environment to talk to my other Airflow environment. How you set this up, again, will depend on what type of authentication you're using. In my case, I'm using an API token. So again, I'll want my connection ID with an HTTP connection type. The host is going to be basically the URL that you would use to access your Airflow UI in your other Airflow environment. The rest of that is going to be you just put this authorization in there. And again, that'll be whatever whatever you're using based on, you know, what type of auth you have set up. What this looks like on the other end, so I don't actually have to set anything up, but you'll notice my host here is this deployments feastronomerdemo.com. So that's a different, you know, Airflow environment. I'll pop over to this one. You can see this URL is what I had there in the, sorry. Looked into this before. It's going to make me do it again. This Airflow environment is, you know, totally separate from my local computer. And this URL here is what I entered in for the host in that other connection. The DAG I'm going to trigger is this example DAG. So you saw that in my API DAG code here. And so I'll go ahead and run this DAG. And okay, so it went ahead and that's a green, so that was triggered. So if I come back here and refresh this one, you can see I have a running DAG now. Again, super simple to set up. If you do have to do cross deployment dependencies, this is your option. It works pretty well. Cool. So from there, I'm going to hop back into my slides and talk a little bit about this third use case. So creating event-based DAGs with remote triggering. I'm not going to show this per se because the piece of it that you would actually demo from an API perspective is what you just saw me doing, basically using that DAG Runs endpoint to trigger a remote DAG. But I want to talk a little bit about in sort of example terms about why you would want to do this, or you know, sort of what you can get out of it. And basically, again, like triggering the DAG is a super simple concept from the API standpoint. But this is actually a really powerful concept that you can, you know, use the API to trigger DAGs on an ad hoc basis and make your DAGs more event-based. We've actually seen this quite a bit at Astronomer out in the community and with our customers. A couple of use cases that come to mind that are common that we've seen sort of repeated for why people would want to do this are listed here. So the first one is, you can imagine maybe you have a website with a form page for customers to fill in. And after that form is submitted, you have a DAG that processes that data. So you don't want your DAG to necessarily run on a schedule. You want that data processed as soon as it's entered. But because the data entry is happening somewhere external to Airflow and it might be on your own web page, it might not be super easy to implement that, you know, event-based running from the DAG side. So building a post request to the DAGs run endpoint into your website backend, whatever that looks like, will trigger the DAG as soon as it's needed, and you have all of your data processed sooner. Another example is maybe your organization uses a lot of AWS services in your data ecosystem and use Airflow for orchestration. Again, super common use case. You need your DAG to run when a particular AWS state is reached from one of those services. But you may not have sensors that exist for every service you need to monitor. So sensors are another great way to implement event-based DAGs, but you're a bit reliant on what's out there in the community unless you want to build your own sensor, and that can be quite complex. So, you know, if you especially are waiting on, you know, AWS services, or this would also apply to GCP or Azure services, rather than writing your own sensor, you could actually implement the event-based triggering of your DAG from the side of your cloud service. So an example of that is using like AWS Lambda to call the Airflow API. We've seen folks do that and have a lot of success with it. Another thing that we've seen people use this for is on teams where you might have people working with, you know, should say team members who have jobs that they need to schedule, but they are not Airflow users themselves. So maybe you have like a group of analysts that need to run SQL jobs in an ad hoc manner, but they don't necessarily write Python or write DAGs, or maybe even interact with Airflow. Maybe that's more limited to Airflow admins in your case. So we have seen folks, build Airflow plugins that will allow the analyst to like input the SQL they want to run, and a templated DAG is run for them behind the scenes. And the API is going to be what allows them to actually trigger the DAG run through that plugin. So again, those are just a couple of examples for kind of the power of event-based DAG triggering using the API. These are just a couple. There are lots of other examples out there in the community. Again, to show that while Airflow, is built as sort of a batch scheduler, oftentimes you see, DAGs have, sort of daily or hourly or whatever schedules. There's really a lot more you can do with it. And the API really expanded sort of how you can interact with Airflow programmatically. So that's really powerful. Cool. So that was all I wanted to show from a demo and use case perspective. And I know we have about 15 minutes left. So I want to open it up for any Q&A that perhaps I can already answered.
Awesome. Well, that was great. And I love those examples and the thorough demos. They're all super, super helpful to try and get an example working yourself. I do have a couple of questions here for you. And I think there are things that you went over, but it'd be good to kind of double click on them a little bit.
Sure.
So first and foremost, right, like someone asked, when should I use the API versus one of the trigger DAG run operators? Like what's the pros and cons of using them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first question to answer is whether the DAGs that you have dependencies between live in the same Airflow environment. If they do not, the API is your only option. You can't use trigger DAG run operator. If they are in the same Airflow, you can do either. You can use the API or you can use the trigger DAG run operator. And which you do is mostly a matter of personal preference. The trigger DAG run operator, has the benefit of not needing a connection set up and or things like that. So if you're not using the API in any other ways, that might be a more straightforward route. But you can use the API as well. And there are sort of slight differences between how it works in terms of passing, configurations in and stuff with the API endpoint versus that operator. So I would say just read the documentation and see if one works better for your use case. Otherwise, it's personal preference.
Awesome. That's really helpful. Thanks for going through that. On the same note, you kind of hinted at this too, but when would you want to use a sensor for some sort of triggering versus the API?
Yeah, so that's also, I think, a question with a lot of nuance. The first, the question I would ask is whether a sensor actually exists for what you're trying to monitor. If it doesn't, then the API is going to be much more straightforward in most cases than building a sensor. And it's, obviously has the benefit of a lot less code to maintain and, things like that. If a sensor does exist or you already have one built, I think it's also probably a matter of personal preference and maybe somewhat use case dependent based on, what thing you're monitoring and how you're using Airflow. So if you need sort of more feedback on kind of how long, or I should say, well, let me say, I would say if what you're waiting for is more truly ad hoc, so it could happen at any time with no patterns, I think the API is probably a more, what's the word I'm trying to think of, like a less costly example, because with a sensor, you're going to have a DAG running and a sensor waiting. So if in general that like files are going to land in S3 about every hour, but you just don't know exactly when, and you want the DAG to run, when they arrive, a sensor is a really great use case for that. If you have, a form page is being filled out totally at random, it could happen at any time. If you're using a sensor, that's just sitting there, taking up a worker slot, like incurring cost. And you can get around some of that with deferrable operators and things like that. But using the API might be a better option there if it's, again, sort of truly random.
Totally. Awesome. Go through it once more. Oh yeah. So another question that I asked was, you showed ways that you can trigger DAGs from the API. Can you actually change DAGs from the API?
So you can't change their code. So you can't like write, well, I should say, I think like you can't like add an operator. As far as I'm aware, you can delete them. You can modify. Sorry, get out of this. You can modify DAG runs and things like that. So there are some like updates you can do to a DAG. Again, it's not like adding code, but the stock. So you can modify some fields. So these are going to be more sort of metadata about your DAG. So the example here obviously is like, is the DAG paused? So like you can turn it on. So if that's what you mean by changes, then yes. If you mean like changing the code within the DAG, then no.
Gotcha. So you can change certain parameters of the DAG and maybe even the state, but you can't actually change what the DAG is.
Correct. Right.
Gotcha. Awesome. I think that was all. Does that include schedule interval? Ivan is just asking. No, I don't see the input for schedule interval there.
I'm pretty sure that the answer is no, that you can't change the schedule interval. So in general, like the issue with changing, because the schedule interval comes from like code in your DAG, like changing code through the API is hard because of the way that DAGs are serialized. And obviously you'll have a problem if you have like actual code files that are creating your DAG and that live in your metadata or database and then changing them through the API. Like you can't actually change the file that's in your environment. So I think that you still can't do the schedule.
Yeah.
My short answer to that, or I should say my long answer to that. Yeah.
I don't believe you can either. Maybe if you were to like directly jump in the database, you could do some things, but then you're coming in a bit of a hairy state, and then you're not changing the DAG ID with the interval, and I would stay away from that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Maybe someday there will be, a change to like the different ways the DAGs get serialized and you would be able to add them through the API. That's a request that the community gets fairly frequently. I think it would open up kind of a lot of possibilities. I don't personally have any insight into whether that's a thing that might happen or when, but I would say at the time that does, then you might open up things like changing the schedule interval and stuff like that.
Last question is the Airflow API going to keep getting built out as time goes on?
I would expect yes. So there have been additions to the API. So the API was released with Airflow 2.0. There were additions to it in 2.1. I'm not sure about 2.2, but I would say yes, especially as like Airflow functionality also grows, there will be sort of more corresponding, anything that gets added to Airflow that's relevant for the API should also be updated and things like that. So that's part of it being, stable and fully supported, is that it is actually considered a first-class citizen of Airflow at this point. So you can expect, things like the endpoints for the stable pieces to not change all the time, but I would expect additional functionality over time.
Yeah. Good to see even more endpoints getting built out.
Yes. Also, I would say, like, if that's something you're interested in, then, definitely reach out to the Airflow community. Like I have seen folks do that who, wanted a specific endpoint and now have, again, like a standardized REST API where they can go help like build out endpoints. So if that's something you're interested in, that's a great way to contribute to the project.
Great call. Great call. I think those are all the questions this group had today.
Cool.
Kenton, anything else from your side?
Nothing else from my side. Give everybody a few minutes back, other than thanks everybody for joining and being really engaged. We, like I said, this was a really fun topic to dive into. It's one I'm really excited about, and we'll be sending out kind of all of the information afterwards. But yeah, thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone so much for your time. And we will see you next time. A really special one for the next session. So be on the lookout for that. And as far as other webinar recordings, I've 3 people asked this in the chat, so I'm just going to drop a link to it in the chat around where you can find past recordings. It's at events/webinars on our website. All righty. Thanks everyone. Oh, make sure it goes to everyone. All righty. Thanks everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.